Yo, what's going on, everybody? It is Tuesday, and I got this going a little bit later than I wanted to, but it's okay. It's okay because, we can't be perfect all the time. You know what I mean? But I got a lot of information for us tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about drugs, drug usage, prohibition laws, specifically around some of our, the more common drugs that we're familiar with, like cannabis, opium products, cocaine, psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the history of the usage of these products, as well as obviously, we're going to dive into some of how prohibition got started, as well as just take an interesting look at kind of how intoxication is a huge part of what being human is. And we're actually going to start off with the list. I thought this was pretty fun, of some animals that also get intoxicated. I'm sure that you all are pretty familiar with that, but it is not actually something that is unique to the human species, to Homo sapiens. So I wanted to start off with that. And then we're going to, again, kind of dive into just kind of the history of, again, cannabis use, cocaine, opium products, and, how they've been used, how the pharmaceutical industry looks at a lot of these products, how they make money, stuff like that. So I got a ton of stats for y'all today. I'm going to break this up, and hopefully you find this information useful. So let's go over these animals first before we do anything else. Let's go over these animals to get high. So first we got wallabies. And so actually wallabies in Tasmania are known to eat the poppy plants, which is where opium comes from. So they say that Tasmania, they actually grow a very large supply of legal poppy for the pharmaceutical industry. And wallabies are known to go into the fields and eat the opium whenever their other food supply is low. So they get high off that opium. Then we got vervet monkeys on the St. Kitts Island in the Caribbean. They're known, they used to eat fermented sugar cane, but now they actually literally will just take tourist drinks and take alcohol. And they're known for like having a real taste for just going after people's drinks wherever they can get it. And then we got African elephants that munch on the fermented fruits from the marula tree. They say that when they eat these, they kind of sway around and stuff like that. So then we got reindeer in Eastern Europe that eat magic mushrooms. The mushrooms are called Amanita muscaria mushrooms. And they actually purposefully will forage for these shrooms and sometimes actually fight over them. So this is, a lot of this was news to me. A lot of these animals, I had no idea that they did this. I knew that animals participated in it, but I didn't know that. And a lot of the Siberian natives, they actually the shrooms that the reindeers eat are a little bit poisonous for humans. So the Siberian natives would actually drink their urine as like a process. So it's like a little bit of a filter, so that they would get high off the hallucinogen through the urine of the reindeer. So there you go. I'll munch on a shroom any day over that. I don't know about you, but no, thank you. And then we got the bighorn sheep in the Canadian Rockies. They eat a narcotic lichen, and they're known to go to great lengths to get to them. Songbirds in Vienna have actually shown signs of having liver damage because they eat so many fermented berries. So that shows a sign of addiction. So like, a species of songbird in Vienna that actually they get a little bit too hooked on that good juice. Bats in Central and South America, and then jaguars in the Amazon sometimes chew on the bark of a hallucinogenic yage vine, which is also used by the natives in that region. But I wanted to start off with that because I thought that that was just, kind of interesting. We're not the only ones. We're not alone in that regard. But now let's move on to some of, just kind of the more common drugs that we're all familiar with, the ones that make a ton of money on the black market, the ones that I'm sure maybe some of you have had experience using, maybe not. But first, we're going to talk about the most well-known, cannabis. Well, I don't know about the most well-known, but, So cannabis, actually, hemp, the non-smokable version of cannabis, the one that doesn't get you high. Hemp has actually been farmed, we found, for over 10,000 years. People have been farming that in the Asian region, in the Mediterranean. People have been farming hemp for tens of thousands of years. And actually, the medicinal use goes back 5,000 years to Emperor Xin Nang of China, who used the smokable form of cannabis to treat gout, malaria. And this is hilarious. He treated it for poor memory as well, which we know cannabis can often be the cause of poor memory. So, but with medicine, there's a lot of trial and error. So, nobody's perfect. But again, we've been farming hemp, because hemp can be used to make ropes and all different types of product. We've been farming hemp for over 10,000 years, and we've been using cannabis medicinally. Records have shown for over 5,000 years. Medicinal use spread all over Asia and Europe over the next 3,000 years. Cannabis plantations actually used to be all over the United States. And by the 1800s, it was traded worldwide. So cannabis and hemp was like a worldwide commodity by the 1800s. People have been using it for thousands of years, but as the world became more connected through trade, it became something that the United States made a ton of money off of as well. And so so again, that's kind of a brief history of that before I get into like laws changing, because the laws for cannabis and cocaine and heroin and stuff like that, a lot of them kind of go hand in hand. So now, before we get in, again, to how the law started changing, I want to go over briefly, we've been farming hemp and using cannabis medicinally for a very long time. Now we get into opium, and opium actually has been used for pretty much the same amount of time as hemp and cannabis from people. Their poppy seeds were found in European settlements dating back to the early Neolithic age. And the Neolithic period is basically when sophisticated stone tools were being used. People were dependent on domesticated plants and animals. Permanent settlements started to come around. So people have been planting poppy since basically the dawn of civilization. And then we have early opium artifacts found from 6 millennium BC, which is 8,000 years ago. Domesticated poppy seeds found in ancient Italian settlements from the same period. And as far back as writing goes, people have actually been writing about opium. There's been Sumerian tablets found from 2000 BC on how to grow opium, how to use opium. And actually, back in those times, Egypt, they made a ton of money transporting opium because they actually had some of the highest quality in the world at the time. And they would sell it to the Phoenicians and the Minoans, and then that poppy would end up elsewhere throughout the world, in Carthage, Greece, Europe, and what have you. And so, we started to see the development of things like morphine and heroin. Heroin actually was developed as the UK uses it the same way that the United States uses morphine. And the development of that actually was pretty interesting, because in 1804, that's when morphine was first isolated from opium. Because with opiates are like morphine, codeine, and then opioids are the synthetic medicines that are made from opiates. And morphine obviously is very addictive. It has withdrawal symptoms. So in an attempt to develop a product that was less addictive with less withdrawal symptoms, diacetylmorphine was invented, which actually is just heroin. And of course, that is even more potent as morphine, and even more addictive, and has even worse withdrawal symptoms. And unfortunately, heroin was successfully sold to the German government by the Bayer Pharmaceuticals. They basically just said, look, this is a better option than morphine. The German government bought it. And between 1900 and 1920, heroin was used medicinally for things like curing coughs and stuff like that. And then they ended up taking it off the shelves. But by that time, heroin had been discovered and was a worldwide black market product. And diacetylmorphine, again, that's heroin, is still actually used in the UK for, it's basically used like morphine. So examples of opioids that come from the opiates of that would be like oxycodone, Percocets, hydrocodone, Vicodin, fentanyl, which is 50 times more powerful than heroin. Those are all examples of opioids. And actually 70% of the world's poppy supply comes from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the other 30% is grown and controlled by the Mexican cartels. So now we're going to get into cocaine. So cocaine actually comes from the coca leaf, as I'm sure you're familiar with, and Native Americans in South America, they've been chewing on the coca leaf for well over 1,000 years. They've been chewing on it. Cocaine is an alkaloid that's in the coca leaf, so they chew on it to give them more energy. And there's also other nutrients and alkaloids within the coca leaf that was a benefit for them to chew on. And today, 75% of cocaine is grown in Colombia, and it's also grown in Peru and Bolivia. And this is actually, the early Spanish conquerors, when they first came, they called the chewing of the leaf an act of the devil. But then, of course, they legalized it and taxed it, because, this may be an act of the devil, but we're going to make some money off the act of the devil, which I guess, we could learn a thing or two from in terms of legalizing it, making some money off of it. Obviously, the parallels are quite different, and we don't want to go down that path. However, despite them saying that it was evil, they still made some tax dollars off of it. But interestingly enough, the actual isolation of the cocaine alkaloid, that wasn't achieved until 1855 by a German chemist named Friedrich Gauck, and he called it erythaxylene. That's when, again, the actual process for removing the cocaine alkaloid from the coca leaf. And after that, in 1879, Western chemists began conducting experiments with the cocaine, and it was mostly used medicinally as an anesthetic, to numb different areas, for toothaches, to numb areas to go into surgery. But now cocaine really doesn't have very many medicinal uses the same way that it did. But it became popular in literature in the late 1800s, and it actually used to be sold in local drugstores in the early 20th century for 5 to 10 cents for small boxes. And white laborers actually used to encourage their black workers to use cocaine, obviously, because cocaine is a stimulant. It takes your appetite away, stuff like that. It would help them to stay working. But then, as that started to be outlawed, again, I'm going to come back to all the laws being changed, because the outlawing of cannabis and cocaine and stuff like that kind of all go off of the same type of theme. So I'm going to get there in a sec. But just in terms of, so you can look at how much money this stuff makes on the black market, it costs about $1,000 a kilo in cocaine, in Colombia, rather, $1,000 a kilo. But when you move that here, they can be sold for $25,000 to $30,000 a kilo, and that can be broken down into, $100,000 if you break it down into grams and $100 grams. So, again, this type of stuff makes a ridiculous amount of money on the black market, and we're not seeing any of those tax dollars. And I'm going to go over some of those statistics about how nothing's really changing. Rather, people are going up in their usage. And again, in today's podcast, I'm not even talking about alcohol prohibition at all. I'm just talking about drugs. And then we have psychedelics. We have things like psilocybin, which is a natural occurring compound found in magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, MDMA, and the usage of hallucinogens that goes back far beyond recorded history. The same amount of time as people have been using cannabis, same amount of time as people have been using poppy seeds. And since a lot of these compounds are found in, like naturally occurring fungus, it's safe to say that people have been doing hallucinogenic drugs for longer than they've been doing anything else, as they can be naturally found and don't have to be farmed and cultivated necessarily, or things like that. Now, the thing about psychedelics is there's a lot of potential benefits for mental health, whether that be treating addiction, OCD, anxiety, depression, and things along those lines. And mental health treatment has remained largely stagnant since the 80s. And it's mostly just been utilizing psychotherapy and something called SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which can be very habit forming and addictive. And the thing about using, things like psilocybin and psychedelics, because they've been shown to help to reduce depressive symptoms and help people to get a hold of their addiction, is that, you got to think that The antidepressant drug market, that's a $16 billion drug market. And part of the way that, these pharmaceutical companies make their money is people continue, whether it be out of pocket or insurance, they continue to buy the medication, they continue to buy the products. But with things like psilocybin and psychedelics, you're not continuously buying that, which means that the usage of psychedelics is not of financial benefit to big pharma. And because of that, we see most of the research into psychedelics either being conducted privately or rarely through government funding. So this is going to have to be something where the culture pushes it forward and gets lumped into the tax benefits of things like legalizing cocaine or legalizing, further legalizing cannabis around the United States, things like that. Because again, there's for instance, a John Hopkins University School of Medicine study of 15 smokers found that 80% of them abstained from smoking for 6 months after just a single psilocybin treatment. So again, we're looking at real results, but after one treatment. And the research shows that what happens is when you're high on, psychedelics, your brain, the connections in your brain are basically going ham. They're going crazy. And when your high goes down, some of those connections basically realign themselves in a more proper way. So like when you're depressed or when you're really anxious or when you're going through something, your hormones, your chemical, the chemical balance can be out of whack in your brain. And your connections can be a little off. And research shows that things like psilocybin help to realign that. Another study from the Archives of General Psychiatry showed 12 cancer patients with end-of-life anxiety showed lower scores of depression tests overall. And, obviously, nothing's perfect. So, but the problem is that since these tests aren't necessarily publicly funded, we can't continue to do the research. So again, this is going to have to be something that the culture pushes forward as we push for the legalization of other drugs. However, one of the bigger benefits with pushing for the legalization of psychedelics is that it has more direct health benefits than things like the legalization of like cocaine or something. Ultimately, there's a lot that we have to talk about. And before I go into, kind of the rest of, kind of the history of like just things being outlawed and stuff like that, drug war statistics and what have you, I spent much of my young adulthood selling drugs. And despite them being outlawed, despite them being banned, despite there being a war on drugs that's been going on for a very long time, I never had any trouble getting my hands on drugs. I sold a lot of drugs. I made a lot of money doing it, and I never had an issue. I'm lucky I didn't get caught. And I'm going to go into prison statistics and things like that. Because again, there's so much money to be made. There's so much research that isn't allowed to be done simply because it's illegal and unregulated. So now let's get a little bit into how that prohibition came about and some of the damning statistics around it. So again, we looked into, cannabis has been used for a very long time. So opioids, so is cocaine, all of those things have been used. So what brought about the change? What brought about, the sudden, change in feeling, if you want to say. So basically it was racism. It was a way to to help control the incoming population. So let's look at some dates and then we'll go deeper into that. So in 1906, the U.S. passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, and that made it such that you had to label cannabis products as dangerous. But that also came into play with, because I'm sure you've heard Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it. In 1886, John Pemberton wrote the original Coca-Cola recipe, but after the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906, cocaine was taken out of Coca-Cola. And so then we moved down to 1913, and California became the first state to actually ban cannabis, right? 1914, and this is the big thing right here. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act made drug use a crime. So from here, this is when it actually becomes illegal to use different types of substances. And when people actually, well, rather when the law actually starts to be enforced around the use of those substances, right? Oh, my bad. I'm looking for my phone. Where's my phone? I'm gonna have to find it because I'm gonna have to read y'all some quotes in a second. So I'm gonna have to find my phone. Okay, it's right here. So after the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, which made, again, drug use a crime, around that time, millions of Mexicans, they began to flood into the U.S. because of the Mexican Revolution, and they brought with them their recreational marijuana use. Okay, so that's really a lot of what did it, because at the time, cannabis was used medicinally. It was used recreationally, of course, but Mexicans flooding into the country. Now they're bringing this stuff, right? And there's got to be a way that we can basically outlaw Mexicans and marginalize them, right? So you marginalize, obviously, something that they use, which is cannabis. So 26 states actually outlawed cannabis by 1925, and much of the world followed. And the banning of the exportation of hemp came about. And during the Great Depression, again, a scapegoat was needed, right? You need a scapegoat, Mexicans and weed, right? So there you go. So Harry Anslinger, he became the first commissioner of the Federal Board of Narcotics. And these are some of the quotes that he actually used as marijuana and other narcotics were outlawed. So here's the direct quotes from Harry Anslinger. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. He also said, reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. And then he said, marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind, which we know is complete BS. However, it's this kind of rhetoric that drove to marijuana being outlawed. And much of the rest of the world followed suit, because still to this day, the United States is a superpower and sets the tone and culture for much of the world. It was no different at that time. Especially at that time, much of the rest of the world, they, weren't as developed as they are, weren't as long as they are now. So again, we start to see the outlawing of cannabis as Mexicans flooded into the country. They used it more recreationally than Americans did. And so, again, like I said, the Harrison Tax Act that passed 1914, and by 1925, 26 states had outlawed cannabis. And, we got films like Reefer Madness, which came out in 1936, which you may be familiar with. It's a very ridiculous, hilarious film now. But you got to remember that major productions weren't as common back then. So if somebody made a big production, everybody was going to see it. And it was going to hold a lot more weight because people didn't have as much access to information as they do today. So that's just what it is. Then we got the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which regulated marijuana by requiring a high tax on those who sold it. And then October 2nd, 1937, Samuel Caldwell becomes the first person arrested in the United States for selling weed. And again, like I said, because the United States is such a powerful country, much of the rest of the world followed suit. And then, we have, and actually cocaine was made illegal for much of the same reason, even though, like I said before, white laborers would encourage black workers to use cocaine because, like I said, it's a stimulant. It gives you energy. It takes your appetite away. It helps you stay on the job more. But just like when Harry Anslinger said that marijuana would cause white women to want to sleep with black men and it made black men violent, and, you got all these Mexicans using marijuana, the same type of tropes came with cocaine. Cocaine makes black men crazy and wild, and it makes them want to rape white women. And so they kind of just used those same racist tropes to outlaw most of the popular drugs that people were using, especially during a time when there was a lot of counterculture from conservatives against people using drugs, and again, during the time of alcohol prohibition, which I'm not talking about today, but all of this is going on during a time where, people were trying to find ways to make society better, and part of that was through prohibition. Um, and even though, like we got Fiorello LaGuardia, he was a former mayor of NYC. He requested a study that showed that cannabis wasn't that dangerous. So we've been having, tests and studies that have shown the reality that that this substance isn't dangerous to use. But then, so it really started to escalate, because once drug prohibition was useful as a tool, basically to keep certain populations in check and in order, that only escalated. So 1914, the Harrison Tax Act passes. And then, I mentioned a few others. And then in 1951, this is when the Boggs Act was passed, and that created mandatory minimum sentences for drugs. So that's, again, it starts to become easier to throw people in jail for longer periods of time. Then in 1956, the Narcotics Control Act gave stricter consequences for marijuana convictions. In 1961, the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs was had. And from that basically banned marijuana around the world after that convention was had. And all of this naturally created a counterculture, because as the laws continued to become more strict and punitive against drug use, that's when you start to see the counterculture of like hippies and stuff grow more and more. Anytime in a society you have some type of strong cultural push that maybe suppresses people in some type of way, for the good or for the bad, there's going to be a counterculture that develops. And so in response to the counterculture, conservatives amped up things even more. You know what I mean? Because then we get into like the 80s and DARE, but I'm not quite there yet. So we see like I said, the conservatives freaked out in the growing counterculture, and that's largely what led to Richard Nixon being elected in 1968. The conservative counterculture freaking out over the hippie movement, basically the kind of the standard image of the perfect family of the 1950s, people being disillusioned from that. Conservatives were freaking out about that. So that's a lot of what got Richard Nixon into office. And then in 1969, the Supreme Court found that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment. And from there, my man's Richard Nixon was like, no, we can't have that. So in response, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which that's when you started. And again, I already mentioned that the Boggs Act, that created mandatory sentencing, and the Narcotics Control Act made those sentences more punitive. But with the Controlled Substances Act, now you put drugs into different categories, which is, the way, again, that they got around the Supreme Court ruling to say that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional. So then we have more. We're not done. Oh, no, we are not done. So now cannabis was banned in all occurrences because they put cannabis up there in the Schedule 1. You know what I mean? So that's what they did. The DEA was founded July 1st, 1973, right? In 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that receiving 20 years in prison for weed, that was cool. That was all right. And actually, I didn't know this until a few days ago when I was doing my research, but Alaska, they decriminalized weed in 1975. So Alaska, they been did this because kind of around that time, around kind of the mid 70s, there already was a counterculture to the war on drugs. But by the mid 70s, people in more progressive circles kind of started to say, let's kind of get away from all this prohibition. You have groups, in 1971, a group called NORML was founded, the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws. So there's been groups who have been pushing for reform for quite some time. And again, actually, Alaska in 1975, they decriminalized marijuana. So people have been moving towards making these pushes for quite some time, which, goes to show how slow moving change can be. But it also goes to show how important it is to stay, to keep that fight alive. And then we get into the biggest anti-counterculture point, which is the 80s, which is the election of Ronald Reagan. You know what I'm saying? And then we got the 80s, we got the DARE programs, the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, um, and stuff like that. And then in 1996, California passed Proposition 215, which legalized the medicinal use of marijuana. And then in November 6th of 2012, both Colorado and Washington fully legalized weed. So now I'm going to get into some statistics around the drug war. These are, I think you'll be able to find these useful because before this I was running down. And for y'all who are just now coming in, I'm going to break this full segment down so that you can go over piece by piece what I talked about. I talked about the history of the usage of like cannabis, how people have been farming hemp for well over 10,000 years, how the first poppy seeds, people have been using opium for just as long. The first poppy seeds were found in European settlements from the early Neolithic age. So that's, 10,000 years ago. I talked about the history and the usage of cocaine, how that came from the coca leaves, how the cocaine alkaloid was isolated, how it used to be sold in stores, and then basically how all of that was outlawed as a way to marginalize groups coming into the country, specifically Mexicans who were coming here from the Mexican Revolution. And then African Americans, Harry Anslinger, I read quotes and stuff like that. So if you missed it, I'll get the clips up and you'll see that. So now we're going to get into some statistics, man. We're going to get into these right here. So I'm sure you already, because a lot of y'all come from the TYT crowd, and y'all, that's one of the things I like most about working with TYT actually is how, just on point people who tune in are, you know what I'm saying? Y'all motherfuckers are smart. So look, the information I'm about to read, the sources, because I don't want to like read every source after, but this comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Prison Policy Initiative, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Congressional Research Service, the CDC, the Defense Logistics Agency, and the Cato Institute. So there you go. So drug offenses are the leading cause of arrests in the United States, right? So I'm sure you knew that. So there are 1,155,610 arrests in the U.S. for drug law violations in 2020. 150,229 for sales, but 1,001,913 for possession. Okay, so that means that the majority of people obviously going to prison are going in there for possession. A lot of the time, these could be people who are addicts. These could be people who were in bad situations, who are in and out of prison. Obviously, well, let me not go off on a tangent. Let me read these and then I'll go down. Blacks make up 24% of those arrested, even though it's just 13% of the population. 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of those in state prison are either Black or Latino, right? So in terms of marijuana arrests, out of that 1,155,610, 350,149 were for marijuana arrests, 90% for possession. So that's why it's a big deal that Joe Biden recently did what he did, moving the needle forward. Obviously, Joe Biden is a half-measure person, but moving the needle forward is a big deal because, again, 90% of the people who were arrested for marijuana possession or for marijuana were arrested for possession, not for selling it in large quantities or anything like that. They just had it. All right. And then we look at heroin and cocaine arrests. 82% of those were for possession and not for selling. So again, this is bigger than just for cannabis use. People are getting thrown in jail just for using drugs, just for having them. These aren't necessarily like big kingpins that are making millions of dollars in the neighborhood. They're just using them. So we got 2.3 million people incarcerated, 1 in 5 for drug offenses. Less than 1% of prisoners in jails in the U.S. offer what's called methadone or buprenorphine, some shit, I don't know, but buprenorphine or some. Forgive me, I got a lot of shit written down. But those are the two substances that are very effective in treating addiction issues. And so we're throwing people in jail, and then we're not even giving them treatment that can help them get off the substances that they're addicted to. So it's just a revolving door that never closes, right? We're punishing them, and we're not helping them whatsoever. All right. So we got 157,000 people in local jails for drug offenses, nearly 25% of the total jail population. 191,000 in state prison for drug offenses. That's 15% of the total state prison population. 100,000 people in federal prisons and jails for drug offenses. That's nearly 45% of the total population. 2,100 kids in youth facilities for drug offenses. Okay. And then these are even bigger statistics because it's not just people that are in prison, it's people who are on parole and probation as well. So we got 238,183 people on parole for drug violations and 510,937 on probation for drug violations. So that's basically people who are living under surveillance, right? For, I don't know, smoking weed, doing some coke, who knows? You know what I'm saying? But again, this costs a lot of money, which I'm going to get into. This costs a lot of money, and ain't nobody slowing down their drug usage. Every 90 seconds, someone is arrested for a marijuana offense. 150,000 people have been killed in Mexico since 2007 because of drug trafficking. 73,000 people are missing or disappeared in Mexico since 2007 because of drug trafficking. 107,600 incidents of accidental overdoses happened last year in 2021, right? And from 1999 to 2021, the instances of drug overdoses have gone up significantly. Now, obviously, we saw a huge spike in 2020, you know, people having to be in the house, a lot of people losing their jobs, their livelihoods. That absolutely contributed to it. But even before 2020, we were seeing the number of drug overdoses going up. So, you know, it's not like this is a new phenomenon that over the last few years, we saw those numbers jump. No. In 1999, we got 16,849. And every year you go up, where am I at now? 2004, that's 27,424. Let's go up to 2016. What we got? 63,632. So again, this is a societal issue. This is a mental health issue. This is I can't make ends meet. I have all this debt. I got to pay for my kids. I don't want my kids to have a bad life. People need a vice. You know what I mean? So again, despite us making society more punitive, despite us spending, and I'm going to tell you how much money we spent in a second, more overdose deaths happen every year. People continue to use it. And like I mentioned before, I spent much of I'm 30 years old, so I'm still a young adult, but I spent much of my 20s selling drugs. And because drugs are illegal and unregulated, they're incredibly easy to get. Incredibly easy. I mean, you got to think, you know, like your over-the-counter prescriptions. Any old body can't just get over-the-counter prescriptions, but any old body can go get them some cocaine or some heroin because it's unregulated. You see what I'm saying? So the conservative concern about, well, we don't want people doing drugs, it's just not being met with reality. It just isn't. It's just not. And we've known this for quite some time. So let's go over a little bit more statistics. Now we're going to talk about how much money we are spending on this drug war, despite the fact that I said this is not stopping nothing because of the counterculture that inevitably comes from telling people what they can't do. Okay. So in 2021, $3.5 billion was spent by taxpayers to fund the DEA. Okay. And $47 billion is spent every single year enforcing drug prohibition. We got a few more stats, and I'm going to close it out with just some final thoughts. Okay. Since 1971, America has spent over $1 trillion enforcing our current drug policies. The number of illicit drug users rose to 13% of Americans 12 years or older in 2019. And honestly, those numbers are probably a bit higher. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're a lot higher, but maybe a couple of percentage points higher because a lot of people aren't going to openly admit that they do cocaine. You know what I'm saying? You know, maybe to help them when they're working on something or, you know, there's a lot of people who aren't going to openly admit that. So I would expect that to be maybe a couple of percentage points higher. It costs $37,500 annually to house federal inmates, right? And I just went over the numbers of how many people we got in prison just for having drugs, not for selling them, just for having them, right? It costs 37,000. I mean, that's a lot. That's more money than I spend on rent a year. That's a considerable amount of money. I mean, obviously, it costs more money than that total, on like entertainment and food. But that's a considerable amount of money just for someone to be in jail because they was getting high or something. You know what I mean? So, $182 billion is spent annually on mass incarceration. That's a lot of money, so come on. Americans spent $150 billion in 2016 on cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and meth combined. That's the stat from the RAND Corporation. $150 billion in 2016 on 4 drugs combined. And and then in 2017, $158 billion was spent on alcohol. So the conclusion is motherfuckers get high. Motherfuckers do drugs. Motherfuckers get drunk. And I think that, there's definitely a lot of the stigma surrounding drug usage. You typically go, I don't know about you, but a lot of people, they typically go straight to the addicts, the people who can't stop, the people who, have ruined their lives over drugs, but they don't think about the lawyers who do cocaine every night because they have a shitload of work that they have to do and they don't want to do it. Or teachers. I know a lot of teachers who do coke because they have a lot of papers to grade and they're stressed out and they don't get paid anything. Or maybe mom or dad has to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet and life is hard. You know what I'm saying? And they're still, like unless they told you that they do cocaine or that they smoke weed or that they maybe do X, Y, or Z, you wouldn't necessarily know it. And that's the reality for most people who utilize these substances. And it goes without saying that we need to push for legalization for a variety of reasons. But it's of my belief that, because I talked about, for instance, like pushing for the legalization of psychedelics. So like things like psilocybin have shown to help people overcome addiction, depression, things like that. But it doesn't make a whole lot of money because you don't use it as much as you would antidepressants. So that push has to be more along cultural lines, making people better. But then things like cocaine that don't really have the same type of like just straight healthcare benefits, people just use it because they want to. That's more about money. Okay. That's not going to be about, this is good for people. This is just going to be about, look, any old body can go into a liquor store any time of the day if you're 21 years old or older and buy enough alcohol to kill themselves that same day. I'm sure a lot of people that are going to see this video have enough alcohol in their house to kill themselves right now. So just the push to, how much money in taxes. I just told y'all that $158 billion was spent on alcohol in 2017, just in this country. Just imagine how much tax dollars we could be collecting because people want to do some cocaine on the weekend or because people want to, obviously we're in the process of legalizing marijuana and we're looking at how much money people are making in taxes off of these things. So ultimately, the only way we're really going to get corporate America and more like corrupt standard politicians to continue to move on this issue is making it about money. Again, things like psilocybin, that's about health. So that has to kind of be lumped into the overall bigger equation of people spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year intoxicating themselves. Our efforts to stop that has failed miserably. We have a lot of things that need to be paid for, such as infrastructure, improving our education and healthcare system. And a really good way to do that is just straight up legalizing substances that people are doing every day anyway, because you don't have to like really raise or change people's tax codes for that. You don't have to talk about changing the tax code for corporations or changing the tax code for super wealthy people by legalizing cocaine and letting people collect tax dollars off of it. Let alone the benefits of if coke was legalized, cartels would practically go out of bit. It would take a little bit, but their profits they wouldn't be able to compete with legal coke. They just wouldn't. I mean, there would be product. They would be able to alter it so that you wouldn't have to put it up your nose. You'd be able to take it in pill form, which I guess is what Adderall is. But, again, legalization reduces crime. It reduces usage because it minimizes the counterculture. So it's about time. And actually, one of the biggest things that I'm going to be doing as part of my political career, not just as a broadcaster, but as I work with campaigns and things like that, is pushing not just for the legalization of cannabis, but you're going to see me pushing for the legalization of things like cocaine and psilocybin and MDMA and LSD, because above everything else, it's the right thing to do. So for all y'all who tuned in tonight, I definitely appreciate it, because again, this is a new channel. Y'all don't have to be here. And y'all are the first ones with me. So that's real and genuine support, and I greatly appreciate that. So I'm put this out on all the platforms. Politics and Papers available just in audio form on Spotify, Apple, wherever else it is that you may listen. I'm going to break this up so that you can see, some of the stuff that I talked about, because this stream was a little over 45 minutes. So I'll break it up so you don't have to watch the whole thing. I won't be streaming Thursday because I'm going back home to St. Louis, spend some time with family, but I'll be live again next Tuesday. And I look forward to seeing y'all there with me. So y'all have a good evening.